In the summer of 1943, the Mediterranean sun was a relentless hammer striking the shores of Sicily. Among their enormous wave of ships and men preparing to assault Fortress Europe, there stood a particular unit that seemed different from the rest. They wore a unique patch on their shoulders, a golden Thunderbird emblazoned on a blood-red square. They were the 45th Infantry Division. To a casual observer, they were simply another group of National Guard boys from the American Southwest. But to General George Patton, they were something far more dangerous. And to the German High Command, they would soon become a supernatural terror that challenged everything the master race believed about warfare. You see, the 45th was different. In 1940, when the division was federalized, nearly 2,000 of its 9,500 troops were Native American soldiers from over 50 distinct tribes. Cherokee, Choctaw, Muscogee Creek, Kiowa, Apache, and dozens more. These were men who had grown up in a country that often treated them as second-class citizens, denied them the right to vote in many states, and forced their parents through the trauma of Indian boarding schools meant to erase their culture. Yet here they were, crossing an ocean to fight for the very democracy that had failed to protect them. The Germans held deep respect for Patton. They called him the closest thing America had to their own panzer generals: aggressive, lightning-fast, unpredictable. But when the 45th Division hit the beaches and began their advance through Sicily, Italy, and France, German field commanders started sending reports back to headquarters that sounded less like military intelligence and more like ghost stories. The Thunderbirds did not fight like other American units. They moved with an unsettling silence. They appeared where they were least expected. They refused to break even under impossible odds. And at the core of this unstoppable force were the Native American soldiers whom Patton would call one of the best, if not the best, divisions in the history of American arms. Before the war began, the 45th Division had worn a swastika on their shoulder patch, an ancient Native American symbol of good fortune. When the Nazis corrupted that sacred image, the division held a competition in 1939 and selected a new insignia designed by Kiowatist Woody Big Bow, the Thunderbird. In many indigenous cultures, the Thunderbird is a supernatural being that creates thunder with the beat of its wings and lightning with the blink of its eyes, a sacred bearer of boundless happiness and a protector against evil spirits. When those boots struck the Sicilian sand on July 10, 1943, the thunder came with them. But before we go further, tell me where you're watching from. And may God bless you wherever you are. Now, let's begin. The Sicilian campaign was meant to be a methodical grind, the Allies probing the soft underbelly of Europe before the true push into France. But when the 45th Infantry Division stormed ashore at Sicily, they moved with a speed that left German commanders stunned. The July heat was oppressive. The dust was so thick you could taste it, coating your teeth and tongue with a coarse film that mixed with the salt of the sea. The air carried the scent of cordite and diesel fumes, and that peculiar metallic smell that rises from freshly spilled blood baking under the sun. The German defenders had spent months fortifying the island. They had studied the terrain, positioned their artillery, and dug in with the methodical precision that Wehrmacht doctrine demanded. But the Thunderbirds possessed something the Germans had never considered, an instinctive understanding of terrain born from generations of tracking and hunting across the rugged lands of Oklahoma, Arizona, New Mexico, and Colorado. Many of the Native American soldiers in the 45th Division had grown up reading land the way city children read street signs. A snapped branch was not just a broken branch. It told you which direction someone had moved and how long ago. A shift in vegetation revealed where water lay, where the soil was soft, where you could advance unseen. They looked at sun-bleached hills of Sicily not as barriers, but as a sequence of advantages, and they flowed through them like water, finding the path of least resistance. One German prisoner, captured by the 180th Infantry Regiment, asked his interrogators in genuine confusion, "Do you ever sleep?" The Thunderbirds had surged across nearly 1,000 square miles of enemy ground in only 22 days, advancing so relentlessly that entire German formations discovered themselves surrounded before realizing their Americans had outflanked them. Major General Eberhard Roth, commander of the 15th Panzergrenadier Division opposing the 45th, wrote in his immediate post-war report with thinly veiled frustration, "The enemy executed movements that should have been impassable." This was more than reluctant admiration. It marked the beginning of a deep unease. The Germans had constructed their entire military philosophy upon rigid discipline and textbook maneuvers. Now they were facing men who did not conform to European conventions of warfare, men who regarded combat not merely as duty, but as a proving ground of ancestral spirit. As war shifted into the rugged heart of Italy in September 1943, the intensity reached a breaking point. The 45th Division landed at Salerno on September 14 and within 8 days found itself trapped in a brutal struggle near a small village called Oliveto. The morning of September 22 was cold and damp. The air carried the smell of wet wool from sodden uniforms and the sharp, biting stench of sulfur from mortar shells that had been landing throughout the night. It was here that the world would come to know the name Ernest Childers, a proud member of the Muskogee Creek Nation from Broken Arrow, Oklahoma. Childers was a second lieutenant, one of 8 brothers who had learned to hunt with a single bullet a day, shooting rabbits to feed his family during the Depression. Every shot had to matter because supper depended on his accuracy. On that morning, Childers discovered his battalion was pinned down by deadly machine gun fire from German positions on a hilltop. The frantic, rhythmic clatter of milligram 42 machine guns, what the Americans called Hitler's buzzsaw, ripped across the valley at 200 rounds per minute. Men were dying in the open, cut down before they could reach cover. A German mortar round detonated nearby, and Childers felt the bones in his foot splinter. The pain was instant and blinding. For most men, that would have ended the fight. But Ernest Childers was not most men. Crawling on his hands and knees through sharp rocks and icy mud, his shattered foot dragging behind him like dead weight, Childers refused to let the agony stop him. Organized 8 soldiers and began working his way up the slope. The sent-off explosions hung heavy in the air, that unmistakable mix of burning metal and chemical propellant that sears the back of your throat. When he came upon 2 German snipers in a nearby house, he dispatched them both with deliberate, accurate rifle fire. He then maneuvered behind the first machine gun nest and eliminated its crew. At the second nest, he hurled rocks inside. When the 2 startled Germans lifted their heads to see the disturbance, Childers shot one but the other was killed by a member of his unit. He pressed farther up the hill and single-handedly captured an enemy mortar observer, silencing the artillery that had been raining death upon his brothers. When he was later awarded the Medal of Honor, the first given to a Native American in World War II, it sent a shockwave through both armies. To American command, it represented extraordinary valor. Mission was sacred, and physical pain was only secondary. One German intelligence report from that period noted with bewilderment, these soldiers do not react to suppressive fire as expected. They advance when pinned. By January 1944, the 45th Division was chosen for one of the most daring, and ultimately disastrous, amphibious assaults of the war, Anzio. The plan was to land behind German lines and outflank the fortified Gustav Line. Instead, the Allies found themselves trapped in a small pocket of land, encircled by mountains bristling with German heavy artillery. For 76 days, the men lived in foxholes, unable to stand upright during daylight for fear of a sniper's bullet or an artillery shell marked with their name. It was here that the 45th earned their enduring nickname, the Rock of Anzio. The cold was relentless. February rain turned the ground into icy sludge. The air carried the salt of the sea blended with the metallic tang of blood and the sickly sweet stench of bodies that could not be recovered from no man's land. Men suffered from trench foot and frostbite. They slept in water, they ate cold rations because even a small cooking fire would draw incoming shells. And through all of it, they stood firm. On February 22, 1944, exactly 5 months after Childers' heroism at Oliveto, the Germans launched Operation Fischfang, a massive counteroffensive ordered by Hitler himself to crush the Allied beachhead. They held everything at the center off-line, the sector held by the Thunderbirds. The ground literally shuddered for days. The bombardment was so constant that many men lost their ability to distinguish individual sounds. Their world became an unbroken roar of detonations. It was during this desperate crisis that First Lieutenant Jack C. Montgomery, a Cherokee from Oklahoma, peered from his position near Padiglione and saw a sight that would have chilled the blood of a lesser man. 3 separate groups of German infantry, backed by heavy machine gun teams, were preparing to wehren his platoon. The air was thick with diesel smoke and cordite. The earth trembled beneath the barrage. Without waiting for orders, Montgomery seized his M1 rifle and a supply of grenades that he told his men, "Cover me. I'm going forward." Then he began crawling through an irrigation ditch toward the first German position. He advanced with such care that he closed to grenade distance before being detected. His first throw was flawless. 8 Germans were killed, 4 surrendered. He returned to his platoon for additional grenades and ammunition, then called down artillery in a house where German forces had gathered. As they fled the bombardment, he captured them. In total, he single-handedly killed 11 German soldiers and captured 32, completely shattering a coordinated assault. The German officers taken prisoner that day expressed deep, bewildered disbelief to their interrogators. They asked, "Who are these men with the Thunderbird patches who fight like demons and move like shadows?" The gap between Nazi-racial doctrine, which insisted Thatnanarians would collapse at the first display of superior German force, and the harsh reality of the 45th Division scourge began to erode the morale of the Wehrmacht units facing them. They came to understand that the Rock of Anzio was not built of stone. It was forged from men who believed retreat was a deeper wound than death. Death. By May 1944, the deadlock at Anzio was finally beginning to crack. The Allies were advancing toward Rome, but the German Caesar Line was a masterwork of defensive engineering, concrete bunkers, overlapping fields of fire, anti-tank trenches, and dense minefields. This was the moment for Van T. Barfoot, a technical sergeant of Choctaw heritage from Mississippi, to seal the 45th Division's reputation as the most formidable unit in the European theater. If the Germans believed they had witnessed the full measure of the Thunderbird's fury, Barfoot was about to prove them gravely mistaken. On May 23, near the village of Corunno, the morning was smothered in a thick artificial haze, a blend of smoke pots and the dust of thousands of bursting shells. Barfoot's platoon was ordered to advance across a minefield under savage German crossfire. By any conventional calculation, it was a suicide mission. Barfoot requested permission to move alone along the left flank. Permission was granted. Armed with hand grenades and his Thompson submachine gun, he crawled through the minefield, knowing one wrong movement would mean being blown apart. He destroyed 3 machine gun nests, killed at least 4 enemy soldiers, and captured 17. His actions enabled the entire platoon to cross the minefield without taking fire. But he was not finished. Later that same day, the Germans realized they were being outmaneuvered by a single soldier. They dispatched 3 massive Mark 6 Tiger tanks to eliminate him. Picture the moment. One man standing in an open field, the ground shaking beneath 56 tons of armored steel. Each tank carried an 88mm gun capable of destroying any Allied armor with a single shot. The mechanical rumble of their engines sounded like industrial death rolling forward. Barfoot did not retreat. He seized a bazooka, steadied his hands without a trace of fear, and from 75 yards disabled the lead tank with his first round. As the German crew bailed out, he cut them down with his Thompson. The remaining 2 tanks, having witnessed the destruction, withdrew in disorder. Barfoot then advanced into enemy-held ground and demolished an abandoned German artillery piece with explosive charges. On his return, utterly spent, he discovered 2 wounded comrades and carried them, one at a time, 1,700 yards to safety. The legend of Van Barfoot spread through German ranks like a wildfire of dread. Wehrmacht commanders began issuing tactical advisories: do not engage Thunderbird scouts in close-quarters combat. They had come to recognize that these men carried a cultural tradition of warfare that prized individual initiative and fierce personal courage, qualities the rigid, hierarchical German system struggled to counter. For many soldiers of the 45th, men who still lacked the right to vote in their home states, who were barred from certain establishments whose parents had endured government boarding schools aimed at erasing their identity, their performance on the battlefield was a quiet yet powerful declaration. They were not merely fighting for a flag. They were fighting for the honor of their ancestors. They were proving that valor belongs to no single race. And in doing so, they made the so-called master race tremble. Following the breakout from Anzio and the liberation of Rome, the 45th Division did not pause. They were assigned their 4th amphibious landing off the war, Operation Dragoon, their invasion of southern France in August 1944. By now, the division had become a battle-hardened, lethal instrument. They had endured the searing heat of Sicily, the mire of Salerno, and the confined nightmare of Anzio. When they struck the beaches of the French Riviera, they did not simply land, they surged inland with a ferocity that startled even seasoned German formations. The Thunderbirds advanced with a tempo German logistics could not equal. They refined tactics suited to the dense forests and steep valleys of the Vosges Mountains. They turned terrain into an ally, applying their natural scouting instincts to identify German artillery sites before they could unleash fire. The mere rumor of a Thunderbird patrol moving through the woods became a source of psychological dread for German sentries, who understood that if they heard movement, it was already too late. Native American soldiers would slip from their foxholes after dark, traversing no man's land with such accuracy that they passed through German lines undetected, leaving unnerving signs behind. A Luger removed from a sleeping officer's holster. Telephone wires cute in silence. Enemy positions discreetly marked for artillery. This was more than reconnaissance. It was psychological warfare at its most intimate. As they advanced toward the German frontier, combat intensity climbed to a fever pitch. The 45th spent more consecutive days in action than nearly any other unit in the United States Army, 511 days of relentless battle. Their uniforms were torn. Their faces bore the hollow gaze of men who had seen too much. Their ranks were steadily reduced by loss. Those who had stepped ashore in Sicily were largely gone, replaced by reinforcements forced to master the Thunderbird way of war or perish. Yet their spirit never fractured. German commanders, in internal communications, began referring to the 45th as Patton's personal legion of devils. They could not comprehend the source of such seemingly endless endurance. The answer was simple, though invisible to the Nazi mind. These men were driven by moral conviction their oppressors could not grasp. They were freeing a continent from a regime founded upon the same racial arrogance Native Americans had resisted for generations. Every town they liberated, every step forward carried a meaning far deeper than the battlefield alone. German position they overran was a strike against an ideology built on hatred. As they crossed the Rhine River in March 1945 and entered the heart of Germany, they were no longer merely soldiers, they were the harbingers of judgment. As spring of 1945 began to spread across a ruined Europe, the 45th Infantry Division drove deep into Bavaria. They were ordered to advance toward a town called Dachau. To the soldiers, it was simply another point on a map. To history, it would become a name forever linked to the outermost limits of human cruelty. On April 29, 1945, the Thunderbirds reached the gates of Dachau concentration camp. The first assault upon their senses was not enemy fire, it was the smell. A thick, sickly, rotting stench that clung to the air like a tangible weight. The odor of death so powerful it seemed to seep into their uniforms and skin. As they moved forward, they found railway tracks lined with dozens of rail cars filled not with coal, but with the skeletal remains of thousands of human beings. Men, women, and children starved to the point they appeared as bones wrapped in parchment. For the Native American soldiers of the 45th, men who carried ancestral memories of displacement, forced marches, and systematic destruction, the sight struck deep within their souls. They had witnessed the horrors of war, bodies shattered by artillery, men dying in agony from wounds beyond treatment. But they had never seen cruelty engineered into an industrial system. The liberation of Dachau was not marked by celebration. It was a scene of raw, unfiltered emotion. Many battle-hardened soldiers, men who had fought in hand-to-hand combat without hesitation, fell to their knees and wept openly. The Thunderbirds discovered the gas chambers, the crematoria with ovens still warm, rooms where naked bodies were stacked from floor to ceiling. More than 30,000 prisoners barely clung to life, their hollow eyes reflecting a suffering beyond words. In that moment, the German generals' fear of these soldiers became justified in a way they had never imagined. The men of the 45th were no longer just combat troops. They were witnesses to a crime beyond comprehension. They saw the living skeletons stumble toward them, reaching out with fragile fingers to touch the Thunderbird patches on their shoulders as if grasping hope itself. There remains a debated historical controversy about what occurred in the hours that followed. Amid the chaos, some SS guards were killed by liberated prisoners and, according to certain accounts, by American soldiers overcome with righteous fury. The 45th Infantry Division had endured 511 days of ceaseless combat. They had watched their brothers torn apart in the name of freedom, and now they stood before literal mountains of corpses. The anger was overwhelming. In that instant, they understood that every mile marched and every drop of blood spilled had carried meaning. They were not merely ending a war. They were sealing the gates of an underworld the Nazis had constructed on Earth. The war in Europe ended in May 1945. The 45th Infantry Division had achieved something remarkable. They had taken part in 4 major amphibious assaults: Sicily, Salerno, Anzio, and southern France. They had spent 511 days in continuous combat, more than nearly any other American division. They had liberated Dachau. They had produced 3 of the first 5 Native Americans to receive the Medal of Honor in the 20th century: Ernest Childers, Jack Montgomery, and Van Barfoot. Yet when these men returned to the United States, they did not return to a nation prepared to grant them the equality they had earned. Ernest Childers went back to Oklahoma, where voting restrictions still limited Native participation in some areas. Jack Montgomery returned to a state where he could still be denied service in restaurants. Van Barfoot went home to Mississippi, where Jim Crow laws remained entrenched. They wore the Medal of Honor upon their chests, yet they still navigated a society reluctant to recognize them as full citizens. Nevertheless, they did not return with resentment. They came back with a quiet, unbreakable dignity. They understood what they had accomplished. They knew that when the world stood in darkness, when the ideology of racial supremacy reached its peak, it was the Thunderbird soldiers, the Rock of Anzio, who had held the line. They had looked into the eyes of the Reich and watched fear take hold. The irony was deep and painful. The seamen had risked everything to defeat a regime founded upon racial superiority, only to come home to a nation still struggling with segregation and discrimination. Yet their legacy rose above the injustice they faced. The legacy of the 45th Infantry Division endures today, not only in history texts but in the very spirit of American military tradition. The German generals were right to fear them, though perhaps not for the reasons they first assumed. They feared Patton's aggressive tactics and America's industrial strength. But what truly unsettled them was something no strategy or armored column could counter. They faced men whose spiritual resilience could not be shattered by artillery. These soldiers demonstrated that courage belongs not to one race or creed, but to those willing to rise when others fall to their knees. The Thunderbirds showed that even when you are treated as a stranger in your own homeland, you can still become its strongest shield. General Patton called them one of the best, perhaps the very best, divisions in American military history. He recognized what German commanders eventually learned through hard experience. The 45th Division fought with a blend of skill, endurance, and spirit that could not be broken. Of modern military discipline and a nascent warrior heritage that prized honor, personal bravery, and the defense of the community. It was a blend the Wehrmacht had no doctrine designed to defeat. The Thunderbird, the sacred emblem chosen to replace the corrupted swastika, evolved into a worldwide symbol of liberation. It stood for the defense of the innocent and the delivery of justice against those who preyed upon the weak. For the German soldiers who confronted them, it became a reminder of their own mortality. They came to understand that the men wearing that golden bird were not typical soldiers. They were the living expression of a spiritual strength that reached beyond the battlefield. As we look back at photographs of those exhausted men, their faces marked by the dust of Italy and the horrors of Dachau, we glimpse our reflection of humanity at its best. We recognize that the hidden truths of the Second World War are often found in the stories of those who had the most at stake and the least promised in return, yet still gave everything. We see men who fought not only for freedom in the abstract, but for a dignity long denied to them and their forebears. A German general once remarked that Patton soldiers were worse than hell itself, because he could not comprehend a warrior fighting for a freedom he had never fully possessed. That is the essence of the Thunderbird. It is a tale of moral clarity confronting absolute evil. It is a story of shared hardship forging bonds that could not be broken. Ultimately, it is a narrative of triumph that rises beyond the battlefield and speaks to the deepest truth about human courage. We owe it to Ernest Childers, Jack Montgomery, Van Barfoot, and the thousands of other Thunderbirds, both Native American and their comrades from every background, to remember their names, to honor their golden emblem, and to never forget that the most powerful weapon in any conflict is the human spirit when guided by justice. The thunder they unleashed still echoes. The lightning they summoned still pierces darkness. And the Thunderbird still soars, reminding us that genuine courage recognizes no boundary of race, faith, or nation. It belongs to those who stand unwavering when the storm arrives, who advance when others withdraw, who become the bedrock when the world demands something unbreakable. That is why the German generals were justified in their fear. And that is why their legacy must never be forgotten.